Well, Shigoli, everyone. Um, I wanted to write something nice for the Truth and Reconciliation Day, but I figured there would be a little more to it than just some words written down because you couldn't get the tone or inflection that, or I couldn't anyway, to get across what I needed to say today. And there's a few things on my mind. So I'll try to be brief because there's so many people giving so many great messages out today. But my message is concerning reconciliation step 2. There was a few months ago where even Murray Sinclair had been exasperated and threw up his hands wondering, well, what does reconciliation even look like? And he's since gotten some help for that, and I'm happy to hear he's back, in the forefront, sharp as can be. He was on the radio the other day. He sounds great. He sounds like he's healed. And as we take this time to consider our own healing, I just want to give the people a few things to think about. And my mother is a residential school survivor. She was at the Mohawk Institute in Brantford for a short time. Didn't like the place, obviously. Came out of there relatively unscathed in comparison to some of the folks that were there that longer. Some people don't even want to talk about it. Opening up that can of worms would be so fatal. But just to give you a little bit of a picture of what she went through for that year, the day started. You got out of your bed in the dormitory, and her spot was right at the top. If you go there, you'll see there's two dormers on the extreme right and extreme left, and hers was on the, I guess, south side, which was the girls' side of the building, and hers was at the very top. It's a teeny tiny little porthole at the top. It wasn't always there. In the photos you see of the early 1900s, it's not there, but in the mid-1900s, late, it's still there now. That tiny hole is still there, and that's where her bed was. There were a bunch of bunks in that room. Hers was one of them. She'd start the day getting out of her bunk and go down for breakfast, which at the time she had a sense of smell. She doesn't now. But she had to take a silver platter to the, I guess you could call it principal, superintendent, whatever, and his wife, who was at the time bedridden. And she remembers, smelling under that silver platter, bacon and eggs and sausage, hash browns, potatoes. It just smelled so delicious. Toast. And the students, day in and day out, got mush. So, of course, when you're that close to bacon and eggs, you think, ooh, this is something good, something we're missing out on. And it turns out that the superintendent shouldn't have been eating the bacon and eggs, and many years later, in a book that she bought, I found out that he was actually reprimanded for living off the avails of the students' labor, because the students would be the ones that would upkeep the chickens. They would milk the cows, and they would do all of the farm work. And there he was living off the avails. And he was forced to pay back $400 to the school, which at that time was a pretty good chunk. And then he got docked a certain amount of his pay. So, a small victory long after. Another thing I wanted to talk about today was my dad, who also went to a residential school, but it was very close. It wasn't categorized as a residential school at the time, but he was there for a short while. And I suppose you could say he wore it to some extent. I couldn't explain it, but he was very protective of us, I know. You know, if someone stole my bike, he would throw me in the car and we'd drive around until we seen it. And then he would make me march out there and grab it, even if there was a huge boy, bigger than me, you know, riding it around. He would say, "Go get your bike." So I'd swallow my trepidation, and I'd march out there and I'd get my bike, not realizing full well that, you know, my dad is a full-grown man, can't really go out there and attack a kid. But at the same time, feeling secure that he was there, you know, that there was, I guess, a witness. And for a while, he taught me how to be, you know, that witness, that person that is there to prevent an unrighteousness, because he had seen so many unrighteous acts in his day. When he was a teenager, him and his buddies went to the fair, London Fair they call it. Before they called it Western Fair, I guess around here anyways, they called it London Fair. And there were 9 of them, 19 little teenage boys all together, you know, with their pocket change, wondering, ooh, what sort of fun can we get into at the fair here? And a London police officer came up to the group and said, "I'm going to need you to break up into 3 smaller groups, because any more than 3 natives in one place is legally considered a riot, and I'd have to arrest you all." So the kids had to abide, and this was the 1950s, which to me isn't that long ago, because I'm old. But you know, think of, you know, Elvis on the radio, and when, you know, pictures started to come in color and that sort of thing, and it's really not that long ago. There's plenty of people that have witnessed the 50s that are still with us today. Things have changed, thank goodness. One of the last stories he had for me was standing in a line at the Walmart, and it was his turn to pay, so he took his bank card out and his Indian status card, and as soon as he took it out and handed it to the cashier, somebody 2 spots behind him in line, you could hear a big sigh, just letting everybody know, you know, this is an inconvenience. You know, that was the tone and posture of that sigh. Well, my dad looked over at him and, you know, gave him a nod, acknowledged him. But deeper into the transaction, the guy finally speaks up. He asked my dad, "Let me ask you, sir, how come you get one of those cards?" And my dad, matter of factly, he turns his shoulders to him to show him, you know, he's not afraid. He says, "Well," said, "in 1863, so my grandfather and a bunch of other chiefs, they went to Ottawa and they negotiated for us to have the right," and this was before Indian Act, by the way, "and they went to Ottawa and they negotiated for us to have the right to not pay tax to the Canadian government, because we have our own government. We're Indigenous." And the guy was kind of starting to lose his attitude a little bit, as my dad explained. And my dad, you know, if you don't know my dad, think of Foghorn Leghorn, the big rooster from Looney Tunes. Think of that guy, and that's my dad. You know, he would always have a handy tip on how to do things better, no matter what you were doing. So anyways, he looks at the guy, and the guy's starting to, come down a little from his accusation, kind of feeling maybe a little bit silly about what he'd said. But my dad, not one to not burn a bridge when it needed burning, followed up, and he said, well, anyway, that's where my grandpa was. Where was your grandpa? Why didn't he go? Was he still in Poland? And that guy got mad. He got so mad. He threw down all of his items, and he stood over my dad, because he was a big guy. He said, I'm not a eppin' Polak. And he stormed out of that store. And that just goes to show that these xenophobes, these people who hate other races just for the sake of hating them or fearing something different, they don't have any lines. He started out hating my dad because he was Native, because he had extra rights that he didn't have, and then he goes on hating the Poles for no reason at all. So this last part is for my own people as we reconcile. Now, I've heard some of our people say, why do we have to do anything? We were just here living peacefully, and we didn't go to them and hurt them. We didn't take anything from them. We didn't. And that part is true. We didn't go to their lands and try to conquer them. We didn't take, their resources. And as far as our part in reconciliation goes, I would challenge our people to take a look at our two-row wampum. Deo hahake, or I'm trying to remember the correct name for it. I used to hear it said. But anyways, our two-row wampum agreement is older than it's older than anybody can remember. It originated as a medicine, as an oral teaching, by saying that this is the path you're on. Know what's on that path and what goes into that path. If you walk with someone or you know someone, that's their path. So it can be used on an individual basis, even with you and your sibling. Your sibling's probably genetically the closest person to you there will ever be, but there will always be differences. They'll always have their path, you'll always have yours. Now you move that from a family, from an individual, to a family, to a community. This community is going to run different than that community because, well, maybe we've got a river and they've got a lake. So obviously there's going to be differences in the way that things run. And then you take that to a higher level, to a nation. Our nation, the Oneida Nation, is a lot like the Ganyakehaga Nation in many ways. Some of our words are identical, like sego. That means still, or it's continuing. And then you take that nation paradigm and you shift that to the world. And this is how our nations meet the world. So there's a lot of different ways that this two-row can be applied. And I just remembered the name. It's Dignit Yohahat. That's what Dimas used to. Dimas Gun. That's what he used to say. He used to call it Dignit Yohahat. And I know some people have called it got swamped, but it's not got swamped. That would be like calling your toast, calling it din din, and only toast is din din. You see that KD over there? That's not din din. This is din din. It's a different idiom altogether. See, what gaswonta is, gaswonta literally means you can't put out that fire. Compare that to gashwat, which is I did put out the fire, or the fire is out. La swata, he's a firefighter. La swonta, he couldn't put out the fire. Gaswonta. Some people say it's the fire that never dies. And as such, that is how we refer to our wampums. They are fires that never die. We started them and they burn forever. It's up to us to gather around that fire or abandon that fire. So it's not a case of the wampum failing, it's the case of our adherence to it that sometimes fail. And the one point I wanted to leave you with on that is that when the Europeans came over, they met different groups that were east of us. But for our people, the first time we'd ever had a face-to-face meeting was in Lake Champlain. Our people heard about the axe makers coming over, and we wanted to do things right, so we got dressed up in our most regal uniforms, and we sent our leadership with our most important wampums for nation building. And when our boats approached their ship, we got to within speaking distance to where we could hear their voices. And when our wampum leaders held up wampums to show them this is what we're here for, not weapons, wampums, they opened fire. And it wasn't because they felt threatened or they didn't want to meet us. They opened fire because there were people on that vessel saying, look out for these guys, you know. So there was interference. And we sometimes like to say, oh, well, who would do that? You know, who was the quislings that told the Europeans to open fire on you? Well, that's not important. The important thing is that we have peace. And the way we have that peace is we have meetings between people, one group of people and another group of people. If we can get together and communicate and live and share and grow and respect and honor and trust, then there's no room for anything else. You know, we make love until there is no political divide. You can take that literally if you want. But we have to remember that that is not what we got. When we, I guess, want to say the word colonized, when we were colonized, or our land at least was colonized, we didn't get a meeting of people and meeting us. We got authoritarians meeting us. So these authoritarians, these priests, these knights, these fighting men, prospectors, you know, armed prospectors, some of them with attack animals, they weren't here to make friends, which is sad because if it were the other way around, we wouldn't have sent our warriors over. You know, if there was danger, you know, we might have a warrior with us, but, you know, not for exploiting any of the native population that we found wherever we ended up. So we kind of got the rotten end of the stick on that one. And for many, many years it was that way. But not anymore. And I would go so far as to say we have not only defeated that enemy, but we have dressed that enemy in our clothes. Our fingerprints are all over Western science. Western medicine would not be anywhere near what it is now without our help. Law, Western law, the adoption of our Constitution, advanced the conversation of Western society. I mean, as soon as they came over here and discovered how we lived and all of our, you know, ways of making our way through this earth with different nations and different life forms and different geographic difficulties in overcoming them, and having an oral repository with which to share that with. That coincided with what they call their Renaissance. And that's not a coincidence. Not by any means. So, I would go one step further. And if there's anyone out there who wants to say, well, you're speaking their language. Okay, well, it's perfectly fine language, but I'm speaking their language because I have a certain audience I want to reach. If I spoke my own language, well, there's only probably about 40 people left that could understand it, maybe 50. Well, you're dressed in their clothes. Well, I would challenge that too. Cotton, the material that this shirt is made of, is indigenous to the Americas. Flax. There's no, you know, a cause to say that the fibers, you know, weren't worked, because we did, and you know, there's evidence. You know, you gotta go to a museum to see it now, sadly, but there's evidence that that sort of textiles was in our repertoire. So many things that came from indigenous America are still being used. And finally, our governments. We had a working democracy that was here. It's not doing well now, but we had one, and that tree that we planted has spread roots all over the world for other nations that have wanted to have power, the people powering their own countries. Democracy. It's still fledgling, you know, because when they copied our Constitution, they took out the parts where the women and the general populace, you know, have power. But I think we're seeing a change, and we took out all of their monarchies without having to send over a single warrior. So when we look at reconciliation, I think we can be proud of how we've survived, about how our ancestors came to bat and met the authoritarians that invaded. But I think we also need to agree at some point that we can tell the difference now. Even Canadians, you know, hate the authority. You know, nobody likes paying taxes. Nobody likes, you know, doing that. You know, nobody likes having to, you know, vote for another moron in office if they're just going to be, you know, stupid. And I think they're starting to see now that the authoritarians that came here exploited us, exploited the lands, that they're really doing a terrible job, and they're killing this planet. And I think when it comes down to a real meeting between our people and, you know, the people where these authoritarians come from, there's a lot more harmony when it's people and people. Once you get people with titles involved, you know, here comes the ego, and here comes the problems. So when we look for reconciliation, I would challenge you to look around, look at all the businesses that are sporting orange, that are sporting Every Child Matters slogans. Because I guarantee you that they're curious. They want to know. They want to know what they can do to help. I've met so many non-natives in my life saying, well, I've been looking forward to learning about your people. What is it you need? Because they see us, You know, they see the struggle, that they see us picking up the pieces that the authoritarians have left behind in their wake. You know, they see us trying to put our communities back together, or seeing us trying to put our families and our nations back together. And they're concerned. So I would challenge my people to come up with a good answer, at least 3 or 4 good answers to that question. What can I do? Because somebody wants to offer you help. That's probably the greatest gift a human being can get, is another human being saying, let me help. So with that in mind, I want to thank all of my non-native allies for having interest and support in this cause and learning about why this day needs to be. And tell someone you love them today. Igiwa.